Hello and welcome to this edition of Conversations from the A&amp Network. In this episode, I speak to Irina. She is a foster carer and an adoptive parent and lives in Australia. Irina shares her experience of becoming a foster carer, then moving to Singapore where she also fostered and adopted her daughter with her husband. They now live back in Australia where they have continued to foster and have adopted a son. In this conversation, Irina also reflects on the challenges faced by the fostering and adoption system in Australia and her broader views on the issues. As always, if you have experience of adoption, fostering or special guardianship from any perspective, personal or professional, and would like to share that on the podcast, please get in touch through the Facebook page, the app formerly known as Twitter, or you can email us at aandfpodcast@gmail.com.
My name is Irina Castellano. If you hear an accent, it's because I am German. But I've lived abroad for quite a few years. And once I met my husband, I actually came out here to Australia. So I'm now living in Australia. But I've been in different countries before that because my father was an engineer. And so we moved every few years. And that has made me very aware of, the privileged lifestyle I had as a child. And that, not everybody gets to live the way I did and to fly around the world. And at a very young age, I wanted to do fostering and adoption after reading a book. And that's why I'm here today, because I love the fact that that is a bit of your life as well. And I would love to talk about that.
Excellent. So tell me about this book. What inspired this little girl?
I was 15 years old and living in America. And I read this book, A Child Called It by Dave Pelzer.
Oh, yeah.
And that was the first time I've ever heard about, I had heard about child abuse, but I had never heard of it being from the biological family. I don't know. I just, that happens to single out a child. So this is a child that was singled out among his siblings by his biological mother and then made to sleep in the cellar, in the garage, actually, on the concrete floor with no pillow and blanket. And that just so stuck with me that I could not comprehend that. And then the second book talks about his experience in foster care. And that was the first time I had ever heard about fostering. And I decided then and there that I wanted to have my own kids and also maybe one day adopt and foster and create a place where kids are safe.
So obviously, we were chatting just very briefly before we started recording, and you were talking about foster care and the challenges of how and why people come to foster care. So you found yourself in Australia with your husband. And so tell me, what is the process of becoming a foster carer in Australia?
Yeah, well, actually, I came out here because obviously he's Australian. But then it was a very strange scenario that I was on a spouse visa. And because of my visa, I couldn't work. Sorry. And I thought, oh, okay, so I'm not allowed to work. My husband traveled 200 days a year. So he was actually abroad quite a bit. And I was literally, thinking, what am I going to do with my time now? Nobody here except for his immediate family. And I started to look through local papers and I saw the ads. Do you want to become a carer? And I thought, wow, this is what I always wanted to do. So I called him while he was overseas and I said, hey, this is what I always wanted to do. Just kind of forgot to mention it before getting married. And he was like, oh, but, I thought we would try for our own kids. And I said, yeah, but, in the meantime, we should maybe foster. But because we had just married, actually, most agencies wouldn't take you so early on. And so I called around and then there was one agency which said even at that time, 23 years ago, that they were rather desperate and that they will make an exception because, we were already both in our mid-30s. And then we started the process. And I guess it's probably the same in England that, besides working with children checks and a police check, that you also have to go through a 2-day workshop. And then you have an assessor coming to the house and they then talk to you about your past and how you would like to, educate and raise children. And it's quite detailed. And if you've been so shortly married as I was with my husband, you find out a lot about each other that, you would have never really covered in such a short period of time. So I thought it was actually quite enlightening to hear how he was disciplined as a child, and yeah, all the things that happened in his life in a nutshell.
Yeah. So I'm slightly intrigued because I work as a social worker assessing foster carers. And I think one of the things I would have thought was, well, what did you come with experience of caring for children or working with children prior to that?
Well, actually, just as a babysitter and as a nanny. I worked for 2 years, as an au pair girl. It wasn't a qualified nanny, but it was, I had babysat from the age of 12. And then for 2 years, I was actually in France working as an au pair girl, as they call it. But my background is actually in aviation, so it was something totally different.
Yeah. So what sort of, I mean, in the UK, again, you sort of, you're becoming approved as a foster carer or registered. Normally people are quite specific about what sort of children they feel able to care for, and the whoever, like the agency is, they will also say, well, actually, we think this is the type of child that would fit best with you and your experience and circumstances. So again, did you have to specify, given that your experience is quite limited, isn't it? Or was?
Then again, I must say I was very comfortable with babies, toddlers, anything, So, and since my husband, like I said, traveled a lot, it was pretty much me on my own.
Yeah.
And so I was very flexible. I said, look, whatever age, anything, and yeah, so I got placed. Actually, my first one was a little baby boy. And then, I had all ages pretty much till, 13 and 15 now.
So what was that experience of having children to start with then? Because it's all well and good in theory doing it, but then all of a sudden children arrive and it's 24/7, isn't it?
Yeah, but I must admit that because most of them were quite young, babies and toddlers at that time initially, I was very comfortable, and I just loved it. I just loved the whole thing of looking after these little ones. And because I did, I was on my own a lot, so it didn't matter if I woke up at night, and I had nobody else to worry about and nobody else in the household per se. So yeah, I loved it. I loved it from the beginning. So been really, I know that not all cases are the same, and I must say that probably later on we started in Australia, then my husband got posted to China, which was a year of a break because there's no fostering there, and then from there we moved to Singapore, and we fostered Singaporean babies there, and also adopted our first child from Singapore. We were actually, it seems, the first Caucasian or even the first Australian couple to adopt there in Singapore.
You made that sound really easy. You made it sound like, we just moved to Singapore and we became foster carers. What was the process there? Because I have no idea. What is it, a similar sort of process?
To be honest, I didn't even know that you could foster as a Caucasian or as a resident and not as a Singaporean passport holder. So for me, that was really surprising. But when we moved there, and quite early on, I found out that because I met a lady by coincidence who was married to an Australian, and she was Singaporean, and they were fostering. And because we started to talk about fostering, how we did it in Australia, and she said, oh yeah, we are foster carers. So that was like, I said, wow, okay, then let's see if we can get approved as both of us not being Singaporean. And when they heard that we were already approved in Australia, they knew that it was quite advanced in Australia in terms of, the training and the openness about everything. And yeah, it's not even as known and as accepted in Singapore itself. And then when it came to this little girl that was needing a home, and when we put our hand up and we said, yeah, okay, we would be happy to adopt her, then it was Singapore being super efficient. And the adoption actually was done very quickly. I got to meet her at 2.5 months, our daughter, and then at 5 months we had the first one-night sleepover, which you wonder what that is going to do. But anyway, we did whatever they asked us to do, and then within another 6 months, she was already finished with all the paperwork and adopted. It was incredibly efficient.
So, I mean, that's fostering is it's not adoption. It's they're not. as much as they're often talked of in the same kind of conversation, they're not the same. And was
No,
there
and
a
they
lot?
shouldn't be.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel very strongly about kids being in foster care, giving birth families a break. And, a success story is when the child is reunited to birth family. That's the way it should be. That's where the kids belong. But let's just face it, not all children can be reunited with birth family. And then it is great that even here in Australia now, and this is also why I would like to make it more known, that, yeah, it has become more streamlined. And especially, for example, when we came back from Singapore, when we started to foster here again, I was actually quite annoyed initially because every time we would have a child, and at that time also we had a lot of babies, a lot of toddlers, every time I met somebody, they said, oh, yeah, are you going to adopt this one? And I was like, no, I'm fostering. My aim is to reunite this child with the birth family. And they were like, oh, yeah, but it might come. And now it has become more streamlined in the sense that you can, here in Australia now, or at least in New South Wales, not in all states and territories, you can actually become an authorized foster carer at the same time as an approved adoptive parent. So that when children are placed with you, that then, it could be the first child, it can be the 10th child. But if there is a child that actually cannot be reunited with birth family, that you are already pre-approved. And then if that child comes up for adoption, then yes, that will be fast-tracked. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is actually a great idea. I don't want people to go into fostering to create their families per se. But if people are open and they say, okay, we want to help these kids. And if one cannot be reunited, then yes, we would even consider adoption. And that, I think, is brilliant.
Yeah. So there's there's lots to unpick there. I want to kind of unpick some of that. So, but if I could take you back to Singapore, because I am sort of, I think in the UK especially, that there's concerns or not concerns, or it's become very much very unusual for people to adopt from other countries. And obviously, you being German and Australian as a couple, going into Singapore and taking a Singaporean, I'm not sure what well, go with that.
Singaporean baby, yeah.
Singaporean baby. Oh, coming out in a cold sweat. Thinking that's a much bigger step than kind of a conventional adoption of a child that reflects your ethnicity, your nationality, your culture. And was there any sort of questions about that? And how common is adoption in Singapore?
Well, it's not common at all. And to be honest, also I'm very much for open adoptions. So here in Australia, and just in a nutshell, we also adopted a child from out of home care here in Australia. In Australia and in so many other countries now, it's an open adoption. So which means that you will always have a chance or an opportunity, if the birth family is interested, to actually have a possibility for you to stay in touch with birth family and to provide contact visits and all of that. In Singapore, it is different because adoptions are closed. So you're not supposed to have any contact or anything like that, which is really a shame because I'm totally for open adoption. I do think that if you can provide a connection to the culture and give the child a bit more of a possibility to have more information, so to help with their own identity, I think it's super important. So in Singapore, normally the kids would also be, adopted out to Singaporean families. Yeah. Having said that, in Singapore, as you may or may not know, it's, very much a family is either Chinese background, Malay background, or Indian background. That's Singapore. That's, the beautiful mix in Singapore. But if you have a child that is mixed race, then they do struggle to find families. And because our daughter is mixed race, they would have not found a Singaporean family easily. Yeah. And therefore, we were surprised as well. But when we heard that it is possible and it is supported, then we thought, well, gee, we are more than happy. And, for us, it didn't make a difference. Having said that, I do think that it helps a child if it is the same ethnicity. Now, in hindsight, I do believe that, but then again, if you have children that need a home for us, It did not matter what she looked like, where she was from. It was for us a child that needed a home.
Yeah, because I'm not, again, I don't know anything about the Singapore system, but do they run orphanages there? Do children sort of grow up in that system through to adulthood if they can't be found homes?
Yeah, they do have orphanages, and they have children homes. Yeah.
So, and it's interesting that, because I find myself often in this sort of pragmatic position that I'm not happy with lots of things, but I can't see the alternative. I can't see a better alternative. And that sounds a bit like, would that be a fair sort of characterization of your position?
Oh, look, I don't think I've seen a system that works perfectly in any country. Mm-hmm. I think all the systems have flaws, but it doesn't mean that I don't want to help and I don't want to, do what I can for these kids to have a safe home, because at the end of the day, they didn't ask for any of this. So kids are put into a position that, they don't really get a choice. And if we can help a child any which way to make it easier and for them not to even know much about the system, especially if they are younger, the better it is. Because these kids should just be kids and should have a childhood that they can play and not have to have responsibilities that are beyond their age or anything like that, to deal with anything that is not really part of a childhood where you would say a child can be a child.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I think often adoptive parents are characterized as being hugely enthusiastic about adoption, but often it is that sense of, give me an alternative and we'll do that. But actually this is the best we've got in this situation.
Oh, look, I think with all these researches and years of doing the fostering, I think we all know that kids need permanency. And what has happened in the past, that kids, hop in the system and get moved around 20 times, 25 times by the age of 18, that's just shocking. Because every time you move a child, that is extra trauma added to it. Because especially if kids are younger, sometimes there's also, for example, one thing that I would love to change in any system all over the world, because I know it's not supported enough and the resources are not there and all the other things. But for example, I really, really struggle with the child that has been in our care that is maybe really young, let's say 2 or 3. And then, you get the phone call and yes, they're moving either back to birth family or they're moving on to another placement for whatever reason. And even if you would sit down with that child at that age, they don't really understand what you're saying. You're now telling them that they're going somewhere else. But when you're packing up and you're, putting the bag in the boot, it's a bit more for the child as if to say, okay, I'm going to contact visit, I'm going to another contact, and then I'll be back. And the children don't even fully understand what goes on. So here we are waving, trying to not be so emotional, the child is leaving or whatever else it might be. But the kid doesn't really fully understand what goes on. And then off it goes. And so many times I have, asked the caseworker at that time, say, look, can we just see the kid one more time over Zoom or any which way to just show the child that, hey, we are happy that, he is there, that we were not upset with him leaving or, any of that. And it's always cut off and not really supported. And that is, for example, a big one, which I struggle with, because I think not just for my children also, who are such a big part of the fostering when we have a child in our care, for them to see, hey, the kid is okay, or, if he still smiles, so he must be okay, or whatever it might be, just for them, for a sense of closure, but also for the child itself to actually see, hey, yes, they are now there, but look, we're smiling, we're waving, and we're happy to see the child. And I think that is so important and totally not supported really with anybody in any system that I've heard of. And I would love to change that, for example.
Well, that's interesting. I could give you the name of some English foster carers who are an organisation called Foster Wiki, and they've just started a campaign explicitly about that, about how do we maintain this thread for children of relationships. And yes, circumstances mean that sometimes children have to move, but why do we have to sever because that's not life. That's not how life works. The damage of that potentially for children is catastrophic at such a vulnerable age.
Yeah, I've seen those posts and I couldn't agree more. Yeah, absolutely. Because as much as, when a child comes to you, they say, all right, and this child will have contact with, let's say, birth mom or birth dad or grandma. And yes, there's this important family member and this one. So that is okay to then support it. But if the child has lived with us for 6 months, a year, whatever it may be, and then it's not supported, it doesn't make much sense, because we would also then be an important person for that child in their lives. And then it should also be supported. Yeah. But that is, again, another story.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's so many threads to this, and I'm going to take you back to Singapore, because I've got another question. For you as a family, then you mentioned that your plan would be, oh well, we'll have children, and then it became, well, we'll foster, and then when the time's right, we'll have children, and then all of a sudden you adopt, so you are become a parent then, and you come back to Australia. So already that plan has totally gone wrong. Well, it hasn't gone wrong, but it's not. It's sort of fostering has taken you a direction that you did not expect.
Look, I always wanted to do all three, have my own kids, foster and adopt, but I never really knew in which order. And I think it was meant to be exactly that way. I mean, we had tried to fall pregnant. It wasn't happening so much. Also, two people need to be in the same country, which was difficult.
Yeah.
And then we had even tried IVF before leaving Sydney. And then when we continued in Singapore, we adopted our daughter. Then we did have a baby with IVF. And so our son was born in Singapore as well. But we also had a miscarriage. We also had a stillborn. And then when we came back to Sydney, we continued fostering. And, we were so grateful to have these 2 children. And we just meant to foster. But then when one child was placed with us, and she also came to us at 5 months. And, just before turning 3-ish, it was decided that she cannot be reunited. And then, we were so happy to also adopt her. So on her 5th birthday, she was adopted as well.
So that's quite a family, and that's quite a journey as well for you, because I'm conscious you skipped over your own experiences, of miscarriage and stillbirth, which are big things for any family and for a woman. So it sounds like by the time within 5 years, you've got this little group of children. You've got 3 children, and it's a really peculiar kind of makeup of families as well. So you're now, that's maybe, what's that, 15, 20 years ago now. So you've continued to foster since then? Has your family grown?
Yeah, we are currently actually still fostering, not as much, because also, for example, our first adopted daughter, she has finished school last year, and she's now at university, which is also very cute. That when I asked, well, how come you want to be a teacher? Because it was a bit all of a sudden, she was like, well, Mom, because I want to help those kids that need help, and I want to identify those kids at school, and I want to support them. And so she's now becoming a primary school teacher. And our biological son is now actually this week, tomorrow is his last day to do his HSC. So we have slowed it down just so that, it is, let's say, a calm household, that we don't have anybody, maybe waking up in the middle of the night or anything like that. But we still foster. We also have 2 kids that come for respite every 2 months. They come for respite for the weekend. And this is another thing that I would just like to put out there, because a lot of people don't know that you can foster even, just a weekend here and there. If you become a respite carer, you can say, yeah, we're happy to foster 1 weekend a month. And we are desperate here in Australia. We are desperate for respite carers. Because there's a lot of families that, need a break, in the sense, not just because, because of the kids' behaviors or whatever, but it is also because maybe, somebody needs to go into hospital for an operation. We have a lot of single parents fostering as well. So it's not that, there's always couples or anything like that. And some just need a helping hand during, a certain period, or they need to look after their elderly parent for a certain period of time, or anything like that, as you know. So, and yes, it could also be that because the kids have maybe more complex needs, that it would be lovely to have one weekend where they can maybe just reconnect as a couple or as a family with their own biological kids. So even those, times are really, really important for carers to make sure that these placements can continue and that everybody is recharging their batteries to really keep going. And yeah, so respite would be great. Plus, there's emergency care when you are flexible and you get the phone call in the middle of the night. And then there's short-term care or permanent care. So there's all different types of care, which again, a lot of people don't know.
You mentioned that there's a desperate need, and we're seeing a similar sort of people are sort of saying it's a crisis, that we've reached a point where there's just not enough foster carers. People are not coming through. And is that is that comparable with Australia in terms of the number of people coming forwards?
Yeah, and this is also why I've really become so much more engaged in, trying to, it's really been in the last 2 years in particular that I thought, oh my gosh, here in Australia now, I don't think you'll ever have a time where, we remove a child and boom, we have 10 carers lined up and, let's pick and choose which one we're going to take. I don't think this will ever happen, not in our lifetime. But it has hardly ever been as bad as it is right now, because before, if we had children under the age of 5, we would always find carers. Because, everybody tends to think, that is so much easier, which doesn't need to be. But but in the last 2 years in particular, it has become a whole lot different here in Australia. We are now so desperate for carers that, you get the phone call and if they don't when they don't find somebody, and because there are no orphanages here in Australia, these kids get put up in motel rooms. Now, we know that consistency and permanency is so important for these children, and you've just removed them from everything they've ever known. And even if it wasn't a safe house, it was still their home and still familiar to them. Now you're moving them into a motel room. I mean, when I first told my kids about this, they were like, a hotel 5 stars with a pool. And I was like, no. They're in a motel, okay? And they have shift workers. And, even if the shift workers have the best of intentions, they're normally casuals or they're youth workers, or case workers that, did not sign up to be doing, babysitting roles in motel rooms. So you have people who do this in 8-hour shifts, so which means that people are changing quite a bit, which is not good for anybody, but especially not good for the kids. And then, you don't bring any, it's not a home where you have, a garden or you have family meal times or toys. So even if they have a few toys, what do you do with, it's raining outside and now you have, a set of 3 siblings in a motel room? It's not ideal by any means, besides the fact, of course, also that it costs a hell of a lot of money. Here in Australia, they've now just declared that it costs $1 million to keep one child in a motel room for 1 year. And what trauma are you putting on this kid in a motel room for 1 year?
Yeah, like you say, it's the worst of all options, isn't it? Because it's you've got that turnover of individuals, workforce, which is maybe consistent, may not be, and then you've got a home that is not. There's no sense of permanence about it because it's not a home, is it? Hotel rooms are lovely for a weekend away, but would not want to live in one. And that seems quite, that's stark. We have a similar problem, I think, in terms of older teenage children being put in sort of unregulated accommodation, but certainly not younger children at all, or not that I know of.
And look, I think that in residential care, you really shouldn't have any kids under the age of 12. Mm-hmm. And because, there's a lot going on in residential care that's not for kids to see or know about under the age of 12. And unfortunately, we even have that we now have young kids put into residential care. And I think also the COVID crisis has definitely, made it worse, because if housing here in Australia has become incredibly expensive, so a lot of people are struggling not only with increase in rents. So if they do have a spare bedroom, I would think that a lot of people take in other people to actually rent that room, or they would even make it a home office. So now a lot of people don't have spare rooms, so we really have the issue that there aren't many households which could say, oh yeah, gee, I have 1-2 bedrooms here, let's fill it. So that is another big issue. Since COVID, anybody with a spare bedroom has converted it to a home office.
Yeah. I was going to ask, and it's sort of a really practical question. I thought, well, how are foster carers paid in the UK? In the UK, there's no set fee. It's depending on which part of the country, which agency you work for. You would normally get some agencies run it as you would get an amount of money to look after the child, which is for food, clothing, etc. And then you would get maybe a reward element. But what is the financial remuneration in Australia?
I don't know if I want to give numbers, because also it depends a bit on the state and on the territory. And it is paid fortnightly. It's a tax-free allowance. And that's supposed to cover, food and clothing and so on. And look, if you ever think about doing that for the money, I think the hourly rate would be incredibly low. We've actually just had a lot of posts here that, a lot of people during COVID decided to get dogs. And now after COVID, a lot of these dogs are quite anxious because, the owners are suddenly away and no longer in the house. Why? Yeah, but why I'm saying this now is that a lot of people pay, $50, $80, $100, $120 per day to have doggy daycare. And that is definitely not what we are being paid with these children in our care. So that is also quite shocking, because when you think about that now, if you put a dog in a kennel for 2 weeks here, you pay a whole lot more than what foster carers get on a 2-week fortnightly basis. So it's not for the money. That's definitely not. It is to provide a safe home for these kids and to make sure that no further abuse happens. Unfortunately, even there, you have foul apples in every system. Which then, of course, spoil the reputation of foster care. But these kids deserve a roof over their head. They deserve regular food. They deserve, a household where they can be who they are supposed to be at that age. And, It's
an emotive issue, money, because especially if you speak to people who are not involved, they have quite strong opinions about whether foster carers should be paid. And my view is that foster carers should never be out of pocket. It should never cost people to foster care. But why shouldn't we pay them? Why shouldn't we pay them? If they're doing an amazing job.
Yeah, and I have a friend of mine, for example, she had her own practice. She then opened up her home to 3 kids. Further down the track, all 3 kids have quite a few behavioral issues, and they also need more support in terms of speech therapy and physio and all of that. So she, closed down her practice to concentrate on being a full-time mom at home to look after these 3 kids. So we don't talk about these cases either, because this lady now is not getting superannuation put into her account for the future. This lady does not have her normal income. And any allowance that you give we had babies, that needed morphine during the night because they were subjected to drug use in utero. So, I got up every 6 hours for these kids around the clock. I don't know what kind of money you can put on this, So these kids need all our attention and support. And if we find people that do that and open up their home and, go through all the processes, the paperwork, all the other things that come with it, that you have to do all the contact visits, of course, that you have to take them to medical appointments and support them in their learning needs and all of that. Anybody who talks about fostering, not, being something that should not even be paid enough so that, hey, you're not out of pocket. And you know what? There are so many foster carers also that take in disabled kids that need, 24-hour care, that then, yes, they need a bigger car to put the wheelchair in. And you know what? Good on them. Let them get the bigger car. Yes, let there be some funding for that. If people are willing to change their whole life to look after people that need a home, I mean, gee, I don't think you could put a price really on it. Nobody's in this to make money. We are in this on a 24-hour basis to help these children. We get attached to these kids. They move on. Yes, we take the next kid in. If anybody thinks that is emotionally easy or physically easy or, anything at all, that is definitely not the case. So, for me, you cannot put a price on this. We're trying to change these kids' future. We're trying to support them. We're trying to show them that they are worthy of our love, our attention. I mean, really, there is no price for that.
Can I think foster carers, we sort of are on the same page with that. I was going to ask you about adoption in Australia, because I'm not that familiar, but what I do see and what I do read and listening to some people, is terms that adoption's had quite an interesting few years, really, where adoption has had a very difficult past, a very, problematic past. Maybe that's a good way of putting it, in terms of, how the Aboriginal community is being treated, and how some of the Australian community has been met as well, served. And we did have a little chat beforehand, and you said, the pendulum's swung. Is it swinging back towards adoption? And which I think is a problem for people who've adopted adults who are not happy with that. So can you kind of paint a picture of, tell me a little bit of what's the state of the nation?
If you're not up to date here in Australia, I don't blame you, because I don't even think Australians are up to date in Australia, right.
Good.
So I would really like to highlight that things have become more simplified in some states, not all states and not all territories. And when we talk about, me being German, I came out here, and to be honest, because I had moved so much in none of my schooling, I had ever learned about the stolen generation and about Australia's history. So I came really naively to Australia, and we as Caucasians and non-Aboriginals shouldn't even be looking after these Aboriginal kids according to the book. And so it should be. But let's just face it, the majority of kids in care are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander background. So as much as they shouldn't be in our care, unfortunately, we don't have enough carers that would fit that category. So in that area, we also are looking for, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander carers. We will never have enough there. And having looked after actually quite a few Aboriginal kids in my care, I have learned a lot. I have already done every course that I could possibly do on that subject. I have really researched it quite a bit, and I totally feel with the Aboriginal community in so many areas. And I'm German, so I can really not talk about my past and our history per se. But what I would like to say is that, a lot of people here, when they say, that they should get on with it and times have changed, it has happened up to 1970s and 1980s. We are literally talking about this generation that all of this happened. So if the Aboriginal community feels very strongly anti-adoption, I totally get it. And yes, if you have an Aboriginal kid in your care, the chances probably are that, adoption will not be granted. And there could be other options. For example, also guardianship is often a possibility. And so it depends really on the state. But if it is for other kids in care, then yes, adoption has become more streamlined, especially, I'm in Sydney, so New South Wales has definitely become more streamlined. There are even, agencies that now do the dual authorization, where you can become an authorized foster carer, at the same time be approved as a potential adoptive parent, so that you do all the training for both, and then you are approved before you start. And then look, if it's the first child, the fifth child, the 10th child, if there is a child that cannot be reunited with birth family, because that is the aim of fostering, we always want kids to stay within their culture, within their birth family, if at all possible. So if they find a kinship carer or anybody that belongs more to that community, then yes, that is our aim. But if it is not possible, then why shouldn't the child, if it is a placement that's working, then why shouldn't the child stay where it is in that placement without having to be moved again? And then, the adoption should be fast-tracked. And
Yeah.
that is the whole point of this. So as much as I used to be upset when people said, oh, go into fostering for adoption, and I thought, no, they're totally separate. I do believe now that instead of moving kids a million times just because you have not been approved as an adoptive parent, then now to move them to somewhere else, it makes no sense whatsoever. So if we can do these dual authorizations for the kids that do come up for adoption, great. I'm all for it, because if that means that the kids can stay where they are and they don't have to move again, then why not?
And that there is a sense we've got a sort of a comparable system in the UK called foster to adopt, where people sort of go into that with their eyes open, and there are risks that, as you or not, well, risks as in you may not. You've got to understand what you're getting into, and you can't get it. You can't sort of manage that experience so that you get what you want out of it. It's always got to be about what the child needs and what's best for the child. But in terms of adoption, I can see that it remains a highly emotive issue as a big picture in Australia, with that, the experience of the Aboriginal, and even I think I've seen in the news recently the issue of how that community's been treated, or how their voice has been elevated or not. I think was there a national vote recently in terms of
there was a referendum.
A referendum, yeah, and so still a hugely emotive issue, and sort of separating adoption broadly from that one specific element. Some people is adoption just this hot potato that it's maybe not in other cultures? Like, I don't think it is in ours. I think people are generally, it's a good idea.
Look, I think in day-to-day conversations, it doesn't really pop up much, and it wasn't part of the referendum at all. It was really more about saying yes to give them an extra voice in Parliament, or no, which, in my opinion, was not very well. Even though 600 million was spent on this campaign, which, if you would have spent the 600 million for in the Aboriginal community directly, we could have done a lot of good. But yeah, I think people were really not understanding fully what they were voting for. And there were a lot of people sitting on the fence because they didn't understand really what it was all about. I mean, that's my personal opinion.
Yeah.
I think otherwise it would have been different.
Think one of the benefits of being sort of, I suppose you come with a very different eye that's brought this sort of international perspective to the specific issues. And I was going to ask you, in terms of adoption and fostering in Germany, because that's not something that I literally know zero about. So are there adoptions? I mean, I presume there's fostering, but is it a comparable system to what Australia has?
I grew up, I must admit, I grew up in a lot of different countries, so not in my teenage years in Germany, but I must admit, I had never, ever, at the time when I was in Germany, I had never seen any ads for fostering. Now there have been ads, and I know there is fostering. Yes, they have a fostering system, but they also have orphanages, and they also have adoption. But again, there's the age limit, which I think is it just needs such an overhaul in all countries, because I think if you put 40 or 45 as an age limit, I mean, nowadays people don't have kids until they are easily into their 30s, and by the time they've tried IVF and they actually find out that it's not happening, boom, they're already 40, and then they're too old to even consider adoption. I mean, I just think that the age needs to definitely be changed in most countries, because first of all, our 40 and 50 nowadays is not what it used to be years ago, and people live to 70, 80, 90. So there's a big difference in our life expectancy and all of that. I think I think, why shouldn't there be somebody in their 50s even able to adopt, especially if it's also kids that are maybe already a bit older that want to be adopted? I mean, why couldn't a 50-year-old have a 10-year-old? I mean, I see no issue with that whatsoever, because that's just also life. People have kids later, and why shouldn't that kid be in a permanent home at that age with somebody that knows for sure that, yes, I would like a child in my life, and it's not a surprise or anything else, you know.
Am I right in thinking that there's not that many adoptions in Germany? Is it more sort of care and foster care?
Honestly, I don't know the figures. That's a great question. I would need to, follow that up.
There's
Happy
some
to send
homework
some
for you.
information through. Yeah, it has always been in my mind, but I never really researched it. So I just know that the age, because, from friends, I know that they wanted to adopt, or they talked about it when they heard I adopted. Oh, yeah, I wanted to, but I was too old. And so I know the age is definitely still there as a limit. But yeah, I wouldn't be able to comment on it too much.
Well, it's been so interesting to talk to you, and unfortunately, the time difference has caught up with us because I need to go to work and you need to go to bed. So it's been wonderful to speak to you, and you've given us such an insight. And you've got this very specific view that brings this really international perspective. Singapore, Australia, Germany. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for being open and honest about your story.
Oh, well, it's my absolute pleasure. And if I can inspire anybody just like you, to actually go down that route and just open up your home and not to overthink it, that would be brilliant. I mean, I'm also happy to say that if anybody connects with me on LinkedIn or even on Instagram, it's Irina Sit, SYD as an abbreviation. So IRINA SYD on Instagram, and also on LinkedIn, Irina Castellano. I've written 2 ebooks on fostering and adoption, and I'm more than happy to share it with anybody who's interested.
Excellent. Well, I'll make sure that those links are put into the show notes, and so people can kind of hook into you and get copies of your books and look at them and sort of find out about your experience and your perspective, which I think people would really enjoy listening to and reading.
That would be brilliant. Thanks a lot. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.